You bet.
Cool.
All right, Tanshi Kiowa. Hello, how are you all? Welcome to Homelands, originally broadcast on CFCR Community Radio, 90.5 FM in Saskatoon, Homelands of the Métis and Treaty 6 territory, cfcr.ca. This is your favorite auntie, Andrea Letting Dishni Kashoon. My name is Andrea Letting. Call me Auntie Andy if you like, and I'll be your host over this next half hour. I am part settler, part relative, and 100% ally and relation to everyone. I'm just me, not a card-carrying member of any Indigenous nation, but I am loved, adopted, related to, and accepted by many, rejected by a few. Haters gonna hate, relators gonna relate. I am blessed to have Indigenous relations in my family and secretly may love them a little bit more than the rest, only because they're the First Nations of this, first peoples of this land who welcome all the guests. But I'm also Irish descent with some Scandinavian, along with a little bit of mystery, and that's the way I was raised. Strongly anti-colonial and justice-oriented with a big related heart for all. I most empathize with my Batoche Métis friends and family and that history and culture growing up, and as an adult have continued to try to live that Mio Pemitswin, that beautiful good life. So from the fringes of the sash, I situate myself as a relative and an ally, and welcome you, my listeners, as brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews, cousins in the Homelands. So let's welcome our relative tonight. So I'm really excited to have Ben Borne with us. He is a communications professional on paper, but a relationship builder at heart. Over the years, Ben has nurtured a passion for using strategic communications to create inclusive, generous, and responsible communities. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from the Canadian Mennonite University and a diploma in public relations from the University of Victoria, and he's also working on his Master of Arts in Professional Communications with Royal Roads. In his spare time, he is an active volunteer with the International Association of Business Communicators and president of the Learning Disabilities Association of Saskatchewan Board of Directors. He's also, among many other accolades, CBC Future 40 winner in just last year in 2020. He co-hosts a podcast. He contributes to Marketing News Canada. He has many areas of speciality, and he comes from Yellow Quill, I believe. Is that right?
Yes. That's right.
All right, go ahead, Ben.
Do I even need to introduce myself? Wow, that was a tremendous opener. You know, you said maybe it was a little like what was the word you used? It could be, I think you said your daughter thought it was a little bit cringy, but you know what? I thought that was fabulous.
Thank you.
I was like, wow, I know so much about this tremendous woman in front of me already. Wow, that was beautiful. Thank you so much for that introduction. And it is truly my honor to be here. I know that many of the other guests that you've had around the table are brilliant. And I'm honored to be one of those people now too that's joining at the table. I'm just so humbled to be here today, Andrea. It's truly a pleasure.
Oh, and it's so great to have you. As soon as I met you, I thought Ben's got to be on Homelands. And so being a communicator, tell us about that. Tell us about your path and how you got there, because you're the first Indigenous communications specialist in Canada, I believe, right?
Yeah, so I'll tell you a little bit about all of that. Yeah, so not the first Indigenous communication specialist, but we'll get to that point.
Okay.
Yeah. So I actually went to school at Canadian Mennonite University, did a Bachelor of Arts degree, and I went to school to be a pastor in a Mennonite church, and I got a theology degree with a minor in music and a minor in communications and media. And while I was in school, you know, I started exploring a bit more of my Indigenous heritage, because at that time was when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was really starting to catch on, right? And it was becoming very prevalent here in Canada. So I was becoming more curious about my Indigenous identity. I was always a status card Indigenous person. And then I was like, yo, like, what's this all about? Let's learn more, right? So yeah, so that started coming through in school. And then once I graduated university, I came back to Saskatchewan and couldn't find work. And I applied for communications job because that was a secondary passion of mine. It was one of my minors in my program. And I was really good with Photoshop, Adobe InDesign, video editing. I was always passionate about storytelling, right? So when you think about pastors, when you think about communicators, we're storytellers at the heart of it, right? So I love storytelling. And actually, if you think about Indigenous culture and heritage, storytelling is a critical piece of that too. So maybe there's something to be said there. But yeah, I applied for a job with the Saskatchewan Indian Gaming Authority in like January 2013, and then February 2013, I started there as a communications officer, and I worked there for about 6.5 years before I moved on. But it was at SIGA that I really started learning more about my culture, learning more about my people, and beginning to explore my Indigenous identity. A little bit of background, my mom was adopted into a German Mennonite family. So that's that Mennonite connection there. So in the 60s scoop, she was one of the kids that was scooped and brought into a German Mennonite family. And we had a really great upbringing, right? But I didn't really understand what that all meant until later on. We can talk more about what that means to me today in context of my Indigenous identity. But yeah, I fell into this career. I've grown as a professional. I went back to school. I got that diploma in public relations from University of Victoria. I joined the International Association of Business Communicators. And that's just an excellent organization to be a part of, or at least it was for me. Lots of professional development, lots of networking. Being on the board has meant lots of travel and opportunities to meet other professionals and understand the profession itself, right? In 2018, I wrote something called the Communication Management Professional exam. And so that's the certification that you're kind of getting at. So from what I know, as of today, I am Canada's first self-identified Indigenous certified communication management professional. There are other Indigenous communication professionals, but I'm one of the first ones to have received that certification, written the exam, and get that ISO certified credentials. Similar to like a CPA or a CPHR, it's a designation that comes with a high degree of quality control. It's vetted through, international organizations that are outside of the profession through the ISO, right? So yeah, that's me. That's kind of how I got there. And yeah, it's been a real journey to get to that point. And yeah, it feels kind of strange to be an Indigenous communicator and to call myself that, but I'm learning more about what that means every day in my career, right? I look at the communications profession today, it's an incredibly white profession still. The senior leadership positions are filled with white men. It's hard to find a lot of diversity inside the profession, but I'm glad to be one of those people that owns that designation, who is Indigenous. I'm proud of that. And I'm still learning about what that means today.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's what I was getting at. I knew there was there was
Yeah.
a big first in there somewhere. So tell us a little bit more about diversity, equity, and inclusion in communications profession. You've kind of led into that a little bit. So
yeah, I think, like I said, I'll speak to about how I see my position in this conversation. So like I said, it's an extremely white profession. I'm not afraid to admit that from what I've seen. I was very fortunate when I worked at SIGA. It was a very, it's a very Indigenous organization. But once I left SIGA and started going into sort of white spaces and onto boards and this and that, I was like, wow, these are all really, really white leadership tables, right? And what a privilege it was to work for an organization that was steeped in indigeneity. and it's the same thing around, the business communicators table. So yeah, there's lots of work to be done, because if you think about it, the predominant writers of, media stories, our producers, our news storytellers, our business communicators, if they're all white, to no fault of their own, of those communicators and those journalists and storytellers, to no fault of their own, but they come with an inherent lens that can be applied to storytelling that is missing. Sometimes they don't see diversity, equity, inclusion, or it's not something that they think about. So that's something that's missing in the profession, I think. So we have this like strong white cohort of people, and we need to balance it out now with some diversity, equity, inclusion. And I think that's where I can play a part, right? I kind of alluded to this before. I grew up in a German Mennonite white household. I've been afforded a lot of the same privileges that a white person has had. And it wasn't until I was really in university where I realized, because of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that I was like, had the first moment, my first awakening, when I was elected to the University Student Council as the president. I was like, this might be I might be one of the first Indigenous people to be a leader in the student body. And no one ever made a big deal about it, but it was a big deal to me because had never occurred to me what this might mean. And the fact that I was the first already, I was like, interesting. And that's just been kind of like a constant thing that's played out in my life. So because of my like white upbringing, I know how to navigate white spaces really well. And now that I'm learning about my indigeneity, because I've had that experience at SIGA and other places, I can like start to use the power and the privilege that I've been given to help elevate other Indigenous and also other BIPOC, quote unquote, voices into the conversation when I can, right? I think it's really important because, you know, we need to start bringing that lens into the different corporations, and corporations want it. It's part of our actions, truth and reconciliation calls to actions in the media and business, right? Like these voices need to be brought to the table too, because everyone needs to be included, right? So yeah, that's kind of how I see this diversity, equity, inclusion conversation. Do you have anything you want to pull apart on that?
Well, it kind of leads into the next, like, what are the steps kind of needed to get that BIPOC elevation, get those leaders in the boardroom and that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I see it as kind of like, there's a lot of, first of all, systemic racism is definitely at the root of all of this, right? You know, it has held a lot of people back. You know, it has prevented Indigenous people, specifically, I'll just, because that's my perspective, from getting into leadership roles, into like organizations that are non-Indigenous. You know, think about like large corporations, like those Indigenous people that are growing into those roles, but because of racism, because of our history with residential schools and the 60 scoop and all the barriers that have come up along the way, it's been hard to get people to the level they need to be into those positions today, right? But it's happening slowly. So to Indigenous people who are in spaces now where they can start being in these roles and being in these positions, you know, I have a few different like tactics, you know, volunteer, get on boards. You know, I think that's that's been something that's been really critical to me, at least, you know, get some leadership experience, use LinkedIn, build your network, partner with other Indigenous people, get involved in like professional associations for Indigenous people, start working with other people to get into the networks that you need to make a real difference and to grow yourself, right? Connect to professional associations, make investments in yourself, you know, go to school, get involved in, you know, leadership training, get involved in governance training, do those kinds of things to help you elevate yourself into those senior types of roles. But on the flip side, there's a lot of things that businesses and organizations can do as well, right? It's not just up to me and other BIPOC people to do all the work. Organizations have to do some work too and get ready to do some things, right? I think for organizations, I think they need to think about recruitment and retention strategies that aren't just for tokenism. You know, they're not doing it to get the token Indian at the table, but they're doing it for perspective, right? You know, I think one of the perceptions that I often experience or see when I'm looking at, or that I see when I think about Indigenous people inside organizations, is that you know, people are being invited into these positions or these roles, volunteer or professional, because, you know, they're looking for that token brown face at the table, right? But I think it's important that in recruitment messaging that people are clear, or the organizations are clear on their goals and intentions for having diversity, right? You know, don't be afraid to tell your story and be sincere about it. You know, if you recognize that you need a more diverse organization, and this is where you're failing, you know, as a communicator, I would always say, tell the truth about it, right? Be honest about it. Make diversity a wholehearted promise, right? To include individuals for their perspectives and not for tokenism. I think when it comes to like board work specifically, or like volunteer leadership, make that kind of work more accessible. You know, personally speaking, I yearn to offer a voice at the boardroom table. I'm so glad that I get an opportunity to volunteer with the Learning Disability Association of Saskatchewan, that I'm the president of that board. But some of us are still growing in our careers, and we require additional support to bring our skills up, right? So I would love to see scholarships for BIPOC leaders to gain appropriate certification on governance boards and in leadership roles in organizations. So if you're thinking about recruiting these kinds of people into your organizations, or BIPOC people into organizations, make this a part of your promise, you know, that we're going to grow you, right? I think that's really, really important. And I think the third and final thing that organizations need to do is, you know, be prepared to embrace cultural shifts. And I think that's the big one, you know. One of the words that we often hear around truth and reconciliation is the word decolonization. And I think this word is really, really, really threatening to organizations, to systems, but I don't think it has to be, right? I view decolonization as an invitation to partner with Indigenous people to rethink and renegotiate new systems of cultures inside organizations, right? So maybe I love volunteering at boards, so I'm going to use this example again. Maybe in the context of a board of directors, you know, this might mean not being afraid to reframe governance structures that better reflect the various cultural influences sitting at the table, including but not limited to challenging Eurocentric structures that organizations often embrace. Have you ever interviewed Chef Jenny from
I haven't interviewed her on the show yet, but she's definitely on my guest list. And I
Good.
know her very well. Yeah.
She should be. So I got to interview her with MCC on the Reconcile Everyday Conversations. And one of the things that she talked about in terms of her work in the kitchen is she talked about decolonizing the kitchen. And I feel terrible for stealing her talking points. Sorry, Chef Jenny, if you're listening to this. But she talked about how she deliberately flattened the hierarchy of the kitchen. You know, there was, you know, in kitchens, you have a very Eurocentric structure, like chef, sous chef, this and this, but she worked hard to flatten that out. So it was more of a collaborative team family environment, right? It was more circular versus, you know, hierarchical, right? And I think that's something that organizations also need to give consideration to when they're getting ready. It's not just like bringing in a brown person to sit in a role somewhere in your tree, but it's like, what are the implications of that person's culture in shaping your organizational culture, right? Because if you don't think about how that might change or shift, you might have a lot of rubs, or this individual might be a really, really strong voice, and they might start pushing back on some of your cultural organizational systems. And then once they do that, that might create a lot of rubs, right? And then you might think, oh, this person's very adversarial, but it's like, no, that's just the culture they bring to the table, right? That's just who they are, and that's where they come from, and that's their context. So we need to be prepared to embrace that cultural shift inside our organization. I think that's something that we need to look at. So this might mean, you know, looking at that organizational culture and thinking about those shifts, right? So there's some limitations to what you can do, but it might mean looking at your policies. It might thinking about way to advocate to regulators on how we can best create organizational systems and policies that best incorporate various cultural perspectives at, you know, leadership tables and organizational structures. But there's lots of conversations that come with a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Fantastic. That is great information. Can you talk to us more about what is missing when it comes to connecting with Indigenous audiences?
Oh, yes. Yeah, you know, this is what I just spoke to this conversation this week and in a kind of like a small group panel discussion. And, you know, there's lots to be said about what's missing, right? You know, there's lots of concern, or there should be lots of concern or attention given to how Indigenous people are portrayed in the media. You know, Indigenous people can be seen or perceived as, or you take one person's voice and suddenly they're representative of an entire culture, right? You know, media doesn't pick up on the nuances of the diversity inside diversity, right? for me, I am an urban Indian, born and raised in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, from Yellow Quill First Nation. I'm a child of someone who comes from the 60s scoop era, who, like there's so many nuances about my culture and experience, but I am still Indigenous, but it's just not the same Indigenous as someone else, right? There's multiple identities and things that make up indigeneity, right? So I think that's something to be considered. But as a communications professional, the thing that keeps me up at night the most is not so much about what is, not so much about what stories are being told, but who is telling those stories, right? Generally speaking, like I said, communications profession, predominantly white, meaning that people who author these stories, have been given this lens, like I mentioned before, and this lens is quite powerful and influential because it is part of the perceived dominant voice. So in light of that, I invite the people who are in the dominant coalition inside our profession and inside the media to give consideration to how BIPOC and AAPI voices in our organizations can be elevated into those leadership and decision-making roles, which will bring new perspectives. And in turn, I believe fundamentally that will help organizations connect with Indigenous audiences, because once you give Indigenous people and BIPOC people the pen to author those stories, to help shape the narrative, they can help create the change that's necessary, because they will literally hold the pen to write that narrative. And until you give them that pen, it'll be very difficult to connect with those audiences, right? You have to think of diversity, equity, inclusion as another lens that you apply to the different things that get run through your department. So for example, an organization is working on a rebranding project or a new project that's launching. You're going to run that through your finance department. You're going to run it through your marketing department. You're going to run it through the procurement department. You're going to run it through all these different areas inside your company, HR, whoever's touched by it. And when it gets to the communications desk, the communicator is going to look at it for messaging, right? But if it's a white person who's sitting in that lens, they might just say, oh, that's great. But if you have an Indigenous person sitting in that chair as well, they're going to apply another lens on top of that, which can be that diversity, equity, and inclusion lens. They're going to say, this doesn't sit well with me because of my experience, my background, and what I perceive to know about this particular group of people how they might receive this, right? So you have to add diversity, equity, and inclusion now as one of those lenses that you use before something goes public, right? And I think that's the importance of having a communicator in those kinds of positions and giving that pen to author change.
I love that. I love the idea of passing on that pen, the pen power.
Exactly. Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit more about coming into your Indigenous identity, and then maybe talking a bit about your podcast and Truth and Reconciliation in Business?
Wow. Yeah. We only have like 5 minutes left.
Yes, exactly.
so yeah, like I said, when I was in university, I thought I know I have a lot of privilege, and I had a lot of privilege because of my white upbringing, but it wasn't until I started realizing, the experience of other Indigenous people and how different that was than mine. And then I think actually when I was in university, that was the first time I was ever followed in a grocery store. And it never occurred to me, those different experiences I had. One time actually, now shoot, I'm having another oh yeah, this happened too. I remember one time that I was profiled. I was driving like a relatively new car at the age of 16, and a cop pulled me over and they asked me about, is this your car? Do you own it? Is it registered to you? And it never occurred to me how maybe I was also profiled for having that vehicle, right? But suddenly, all those experiences kind of come together, and I'm like, wow, I have kind of in this really odd position of knowing what it means, and I've witnessed the power of whiteness and the privilege that comes with whiteness, and also beginning to understand this indigeneity. So when I was in university, I spent a lot of time, researching Indigenous spirituality and writing about it, and then working for SIGA, and like all of that coming together. I'm starting to understand who I am as an Indigenous person, and how, while I think I touched on this before a little bit as well, I'm part, I have an Indigenous identity, but I am only one voice of a very diverse nation inside a nation, right? Don't represent everybody, right? But I always struggled with and I still struggle from time to time, is like, what does it mean for me to be Indigenous today if I haven't had the same struggle as everybody else, right? I don't know that, but there are some aspects that I know. I look at my relationship with my parent. My parent had a very different experience because of her experience with the 60s scoop, with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and all of that, how that has influenced my life. And so intergenerational trauma plays a part of this too. Yeah, I'm still wrestling with it all. I'm coming into it. I'm coming into indigeneity. I'm figuring it out. I think as a lot of people are too, my generation. We'll see as I still wrestle with it, how it comes out. But today I think for the first time in my life within the last 5 years, I've been very proud of my Indigenous identity, right? I don't try to blend in anymore. I'm proud to talk about my experience, but who I am, and it's been a journey and it's ongoing.
That's awesome. So in the last maybe minute or two, could you tell us a bit about your podcast and about Truth and Reconciliation?
Yeah. So MCC Saskatchewan is one of my other employers next to the company that I co-own, Symmetry PR. So MCC Saskatchewan about 2 years ago started this podcast called Reconcile Everyday Conversations. And the first season was really focused on bringing in white people to reflect on what truth and reconciliation meant. And the second season was really focused on bringing Indigenous people to talk about what truth and reconciliation meant. And that's how we got Chef Jenny in, right? Had that conversation with her. And it has been such an honor to sit at this table with all these wise storytellers from many, many diverse experiences. And I think also it was at those tables that I started also becoming to realize that, oh, this is such a diverse group of people. And I'm part of this story too, right? One thread, that is pulling together this mosaic, this beautiful piece of fabric that ties together this culture, right? So I encourage people to get out and listen to that podcast. We're starting our third season soon. We're going to be interviewing more people on truth and reconciliation, but this time from different kinds of sectors. It's going to be really interesting as we start launching that this fall. But I guess stay tuned and listen to it today. I think what we've done, and I think it'll be really, really interesting for everyone to hear.
So, and where can you find that podcast and what's it called?
It's called Reconcile Everyday Conversations, and you can find it on any of your major streaming platforms.
Awesome.
It's awesome. It's a great project that MCC has been doing here in Saskatchewan.
That's fantastic. Well, I guess we've run out of time and we've run the gamut. But thank you so much for joining us tonight, Ben. Kishi Marcy to our relative tonight, Ben Borne of Symmetry PR, and look him up if you ever need help with communications. He will help you. So Niwagamaгаnak, all my relations, and believe me, we are all related, so act like you've got relations. This is Auntie Andy signing out from Homelands, originally produced on CFCR Community Radio 90.5 FM in Saskatoon, Homelands of the Métis and Treaty 6 territory, cfcr.ca. You can find excellent programming on Indian and Cowboy podcasting. Follow us on Twitter at Métis Homelands, or if you have comments, questions, or guest suggestions, email métishomelands@gmail.com. This episode will also be viewable on our YouTube channel, Homelands, so subscribe today. Marcy, thank you for listening, and Akoshi, Kawapa Matino Walmina. That's all. We'll see you later.